There's something I've never told anyone before. Something so personal, so deeply buried, that I've never found the courage to put it into words. Even now, I feel my chest tighten as I begin, unsure how to explain it or what it even means. It's about my friend's brother, a person who was always just there. He was familiar, almost background noise in my life. We never had much reason to interact beyond polite greetings or casual conversations at family gatherings. He was just part of the scenery, someone I'd seen 100 times without really seeing. But recently, something shifted. I don't know when or why I started noticing him differently. Maybe it was the way he changed after moving back home, like life had left subtle marks on him. He seemed more grown up now, more self-assured, almost magnetic in a way I couldn't describe. His once boyish face had sharpened into something more striking, and his laughter carried a depth that made me stop and listen. I found myself stealing glances when he wasn't looking, lingering on the way he moved, the way he carried himself with an ease that felt entirely new. At first, I brushed it off as simple curiosity. After all, he'd been away for a while, and people change. But as the days passed, I realized it wasn't just about noticing him, it was about feeling something I couldn't quite name. I'd catch myself replaying moments in my head, moments that should have been insignificant, the way his hand brushed against mine when we passed in the hallway, the warmth of his smile when he joked about something mundane. These weren't supposed to matter. And yet, they did. There was something in the air now, something charged and heavy that I couldn't ignore. It felt like the ground beneath my feet had shifted ever so slightly, and suddenly, I was seeing him in a light I didn't recognize, a light I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. Growing up, my friend's brother, Adam, was just a part of the backdrop of my life. He was always around, always present in that casual, unremarkable way family friends often are. He was the older brother who would occasionally tease us when we played video games in their basement, stealing the controller to show off a move before tossing it back with a smirk. Back then, he was just Adam, familiar, ordinary, and easy to ignore. But that night, everything shifted. I was sitting alone in the living room, scrolling mindlessly on my phone after everyone else had gone to bed. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. I didn't even notice him at first when he walked in, his footsteps soft against the carpet. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and smooth, breaking the stillness. I looked up, startled to see Adam standing there, leaning casually against the doorway. He looked different in the dim light, more relaxed, his usual sharp edges softened. "Not really," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He moved closer, crossing the room in a few unhurried steps until he stood just a foot away. I felt the shift in the air immediately, the weight of his presence pressing down on me. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. "You've changed," he said finally, his tone almost teasing but laced with something else, something deeper. "Have I?" I managed to ask, my voice catching in my throat. He smiled, but it wasn't the playful smirk I remembered. It was softer, more deliberate. "Yeah," he said, his gaze unwavering. "You have." Before I could process what was happening, he was sitting beside me, so close I could feel the heat radiating off him. My heart raced as his knee brushed against mine, a touch so light it could have been accidental, except I knew it wasn't. "Adam," I started, but the words failed me. He leaned in then, his face inches from mine. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice barely audible but heavy with meaning. I should have said something, anything, but I couldn't. I was frozen, caught in the magnetic pull between us. And then, before I could think better of it, his lips were on mine. The kiss was slow at first, testing, as if he was giving me time to pull away. But when I didn't, it deepened, his hand coming up to cradle my jaw as he tilted my face toward him. My heart pounded in my chest, the world narrowing to just him. The feel of his lips, the warmth of his touch, the soft sigh that escaped him when I kissed him back. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, and completely unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Every rational thought vanished, replaced by the sheer intensity of the moment. It felt both impossible and inevitable, like this was where we'd been heading all along. When he finally pulled back, his forehead rested lightly against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "I shouldn't have done that," he whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. I swallowed hard, my mind spinning, but the only thing I could think to say was, "Then why did you?" His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw something raw and unguarded there. "Because I couldn't stop myself," he admitted, his voice breaking just slightly. And as much as I wanted to deny it, to push him away and pretend this never happened, I knew deep down that I couldn't stop myself either. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw something raw and unguarded there. "Because I couldn't stop myself," he admitted, his voice breaking just slightly. And as much as I wanted to deny it, to push him away and pretend this never happened, I knew deep down that I couldn't stop myself either. The shift between Adam and me was subtle at first, like a faint current running beneath the surface of otherwise ordinary moments. We started spending more time together, not intentionally, at least not on my part. It just happened. He would linger in the kitchen while I grabbed a drink, casually leaning against the counter, his eyes catching mine mid-conversation. Or he'd sit a little closer when we all watched a movie, his knee brushing against mine, sparking an awareness I couldn't ignore. It was the small things that began to gnaw at me. The way his voice seemed softer when he spoke to me, the faint trace of cologne I'd catch when he leaned in to grab something. I found myself hyper-aware of his presence, noticing every detail. His hair was darker than I remembered, with strands that curled slightly at the ends when he let it grow out. His hands, strong and capable, seemed to linger longer when they passed me something. And his smile, it wasn't just friendly anymore. There was something behind it, something I couldn't quite place but couldn't stop thinking about. And that was the problem. I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time he walked into the room, my pulse quickened. I hated it. I hated the way my thoughts would wander late at night, replaying the smallest moments as if they meant more than they did. I hated the guilt that followed, the voice in my head telling me this wasn't right, that I had no business feeling this way. But Adam didn't make it easy. He had a way of making me feel seen in a way no one else ever had. One evening, we ended up in the backyard, the others having gone inside. The air was cool, the grass damp beneath our feet as we talked. He was so close I could feel the warmth of him, hear the quiet catch in his breath when he laughed. When he touched my arm to emphasize something he was saying, it sent a jolt through me that I tried desperately to hide. "You okay?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. "Yeah," I managed, my voice barely steady. But I wasn't okay. Not at all.
I was torn between wanting to pull away and wanting to stay right there, frozen in the moment. I tried to create distance, making excuses to leave a room, avoiding situations where we'd end up alone. But he always found a way to close the gap. A light-hearted joke, a nudge of his shoulder against mine, the way his gaze would linger just a second too long. Each time, I told myself it didn't mean anything. But it felt like everything. The internal battle was constant. Every time I caught myself looking at him, my mind screamed at me to stop, to push these feelings away before they spiraled out of control. But then he'd smile at me, or say something that made my heart skip, and all my resolve would crumble. One night, as we were cleaning up after dinner, our hands brushed while reaching for the same dish. He didn't pull away immediately, and neither did I. For a second, we just stood there, the world around us fading into the background. My chest tightened, my mind racing with 100 thoughts I couldn't untangle. "Sorry," I muttered, breaking the moment as I stepped back, my cheeks burning. But his eyes stayed on me, soft and searching. "You don't have to be," he said quietly. That simple statement sent a wave of emotion crashing over me. Hope, fear, guilt, all tangled together in a way that left me breathless. I knew I should draw the line right there, put an end to whatever this was before it went too far. But something about the way he looked at me made it impossible to move, to speak, to even think clearly. And so the dance continued, a delicate, unspoken push and pull that neither of us acknowledged, but both of us felt. Every interaction became a test of my willpower, and every time, I found myself failing, drawn deeper into something I didn't know how to escape. It was late one evening when everything finally tipped over the edge. My friend had gone out for the night, leaving me at their house to work on a project I couldn't finish at home. I was sprawled out at the dining table, papers scattered everywhere, when Adam walked in. He was fresh out of the shower, a damp towel slung over his shoulder, his hair tousled and sticking to his forehead. He wore a loose t-shirt and sweats that hung low on his hips, casual but somehow disarming in their simplicity. "Still working?" he asked, his voice carrying that smooth, low timbre I'd grown far too attuned to. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my focus on the papers in front of me. "Mind if I keep you company?" I hesitated, but nodded. "Sure." He sat across from me, scrolling through his phone for a while, but I could feel his eyes on me every so often. My skin prickled under the weight of his gaze, and I couldn't concentrate. When I finally looked up, I caught him staring. He didn't look away. "You're tense," he said, leaning forward. "It's just this project," I lied, though my heart was hammering for entirely different reasons. "Here." He got up, walked around the table, and stood behind me. Before I could ask what he was doing, his hands were on my shoulders, firm and warm. He began to knead the tension there, his thumbs pressing into my muscles. "Relax," he said softly, his breath brushing against my ear. I froze, torn between leaning into his touch and pulling away. "Adam," I started, but the words caught in my throat when his fingers moved lower, grazing the edge of my neck. "It's okay," he murmured. "You're always so wound up." My head spun. This was crossing a line, and I knew it. But I didn't stop him. I couldn't. His hands were steady, his movements deliberate, and the air between us felt thick, electric. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned closer, his lips just inches from my ear. "Because I think you want me to." Time seemed to stop. My chest tightened as a flood of emotions surged through me. Desire, fear, guilt, and something I couldn't name. I turned to face him, and for a moment we were eye to eye, the world around us fading into nothing. "Adam," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if it was a protest or a plea. He reached out, his fingers brushing against my cheek. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice soft but steady. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself leaning forward, the space between us vanishing until his lips were on mine. The kiss was hesitant at first, testing the waters, but it quickly deepened, growing more urgent, more real. My hands found their way to his chest, gripping his shirt as if to anchor myself. And then, just as suddenly, I pulled away, my breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. "This is wrong," I said, my voice shaking. "We can't." "Why not?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. "Because—" I couldn't finish the sentence. Every argument I tried to form crumbled under the weight of how badly I wanted him, how much I'd been fighting this feeling for weeks. "I think about you too," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. His words hit me like a punch to the gut, equal parts relief and terror. He felt it too, this thing between us, whatever it was. But that only made it worse, made it harder to push him away. "We can't," I repeated, though the conviction in my voice was waning. Adam stepped back, giving me space, but the tension in the air didn't dissipate. If anything, it grew stronger, more unbearable. He looked at me with an intensity that made my knees weak, as if daring me to make the next move. "I'll go," he said finally, his voice heavy with something I couldn't place. "Unless you ask me to stay." He turned to leave, and my heart felt like it was being torn in two. I should have let him go. I should have taken the out he was giving me. But as his hand reached for the door, I found myself saying his name. He paused, turning back to look at me. And in that moment, I knew I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't undo. It was the S there, his hand on the doorframe, waiting for me to say something. Anything. My name lingered on his lips like a question, his gaze piercing, full of something unspoken yet undeniable. My mind screamed at me to stop, to let him leave, but my body had other plans. Before I could think better of it, I was moving, crossing the small distance between us as if pulled by an invisible force. "Don't go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Adam turned fully, his eyes searching mine for a fraction of a second before closing the space between us. The moment our lips met, it was as if every pent-up thought, every stolen glance, every unspoken word exploded into reality. His kiss was deep, urgent, pulling me into him like gravity. His hands cupped my face, steady and firm, grounding me even as I felt like I was free falling. I couldn't think anymore, couldn't reason or argue with myself. All that mattered was the way he felt against me, the heat of his body, the faint taste of mint on his lips. His hand slid down, gripping my waist and pulling me closer until there wasn't an inch of space left between us. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it, my breath coming in short, desperate gasps between kisses. The room seemed to blur around us, my senses narrowing in on him. His scent, a mix of soap and something uniquely his, the roughness of his stubble against my skin, the soft, guttural sounds he made when my fingers tangled in his hair. Every touch sent a shiver down my spine, every movement pushing me further into a haze of longing I couldn't escape. His hands found their way under my shirt, his fingers skimming over my skin, leaving a trail of fire in their wake. I gasped at the sensation, my body arching into him instinctively. He pulled back for a moment, his forehead resting against mine, his breathing just as ragged as my own. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low and strained, full of hesitation and hope. I couldn't find the words, so I answered by pulling him back to me, my lips crashing against his with a need I didn't know I possessed. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the guilt, not the questions, not the world beyond the four walls of that room. It was raw, overwhelming, and entirely consuming. And as we surrendered to the intensity between us, I realized there was no turning back. The room was silent except for the sound of our breathing, heavy and uneven as we lay there, tangled in each other. The adrenaline was still coursing through me, my skin buzzing with the aftershock of everything we'd just done. Adam's arm was draped over me, his fingers idly tracing circles on my shoulder, but neither of us said a word. It was as if speaking might shatter the fragile, electric stillness that surrounded us. I stared at the ceiling, my mind a chaotic swirl of emotions. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on me, a strange mix of elation and dread. I felt his gaze on me, soft and searching, but I couldn't bring myself to meet his eyes. What could I possibly say? "Hey," he murmured after a while, his voice low and tender. "You okay?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was true. "Yeah," I whispered, but the tremor in my voice betrayed me. Adam shifted, propping himself up on one elbow. "We don't have to talk about it right now," he said, his tone gentle, as if he could sense the storm raging inside me. "But I just want you to know, I don't regret it." His words hit me like a punch to the chest. I turned to look at him, his face so open, so sincere, and for a moment I envied his certainty. But I couldn't share it. Not completely. After he left, I sat there alone, the weight of the night settling over me like a heavy blanket. I replayed every moment in my mind, each touch, each look, each breathless word. My body still ached with the memory of him, but my heart ached even more. The guilt crept in slowly, like a shadow creeping across a sunlit room. I knew this wasn't something that could be easily forgotten or undone. The lines we'd crossed weren't ones I could pretend didn't exist. But at the same time, I couldn't bring myself to wish it hadn't happened. It felt wrong, undeniably so, yet there was a part of me, a selfish, desperate part, that wanted to hold on to it, to keep the memory of his touch, his warmth, alive. In the days that followed, I found myself drifting between moments of clarity and confusion. I'd think about the way his hand fit against mine, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world, and I'd feel a pang of longing so intense it left me breathless. But then the guilt would return, sharp and biting, reminding me of all the reasons this was a mistake. And yet, deep down, I knew this wasn't something I could simply move past. Adam had left a mark on me, one I wasn't sure would ever fade. As I sit here now, writing this, I wonder what comes next. What does this mean for us? For me? I don't have the answers, and maybe I never will. All I know is that for better or worse, that night changed everything. And no matter how much I wrestle with the guilt, I can't deny the truth. I don't regret it either.